Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is our first event of the year for Comcan, and this is also the first big one in person, I guess, since COVID. We have had small ones, but so this is very exciting. Thank you for coming. Happy New Year. We'll acknowledge that we are meeting today on the ancestral, traditional, non-ceded territory of the Musqueam people. We're very grateful for that. And I'll also start by thanking two great persons who have spent a lot of energy on this, Catherine and Jory, as the Comcan assistants. A lot of emails, a lot of work. Thank you. And then this one is also unusual. It's co-sponsored by Comcan and the Conway Chair under the SPPGA and Institute of Asian Research. So it's a joint effort. And so Kai is here, the director of IER. Thank you. And so now it's a great joy to introduce to you the speaker that we have with a big idea and a big book. And Dan Slater, who is the first of the two co-authors, is going to present big ideas from this book, From Development to Democracy, which is a terrific big book. There are few of those out there, right? We often do much more narrow work, and this is asking big questions. You know, when do democracy processes fail? When do they succeed? And what can kickstart one? You know, what happens? And they actually go against some of the conventional literature, so it's very, very interesting. And then we'll have a few discussant words from Constant, who is asking the same question in his PhD, looking at South Asia only and coding some of the cases slightly differently. So we want this to be controversial and hot. And so thank you everyone for being here. Did I forget anything to say? No, we're good. All right, so the floor is yours. Oh, and welcome to those online. Do we know how many people are online?
About 25, or at least.
Okay. Oh, 25 online. Wow, great.
Well, terrific. Well, this is really exciting. What a great turnout. I guess the lesson is always give talks when there's free curry. So this is great. Thanks a lot to Catherine, to Jory, to Eve, to Kai, to everybody who helped make this possible. And this is great. Such a big turnout. He was saying it's the biggest, but I guess it might also be the smallest because it's the first of the year. So time will tell whether this is our biggest or our smallest turnout. But yeah, so it's wonderful to be in Vancouver. It's a little strange to be across the border and not be here with Joe. Joe Wong, University of Toronto, who is my co-author. I'm sure he would love to be here as well. So all the mistakes I make will certainly be on his account. So this is a book that came out in September, and hopefully it is not narrow, as Eve was saying. And let me just sort of give you a relatively kind of brush clearing sense of what's in the book. The book talks about 12 cases, so I'm not going to be going into a tremendous amount of depth on any one of them, but really, anticipate and eagerly await questions on any of the cases that we'll be talking about, as well as the theories involved. So this is the title of the book, From Development to Democracy, Transformations of Modern Asia. And I should say, I guess, two things about the title at the outset. One is I don't know what modern Asia is. This is a subtitle that was forced upon us. In fact, what the press wanted to do was they said the book should be called just The Transformations of Modern Asia. And actually a good way to sort of know what we're arguing in the book is to know that until the very last minute, the title of the book was Democracy Through Strength. And what the theory that we're presenting in the book is about how democracy can arise not from a collapsing or weak authoritarian regime, but from a strong authoritarian regime that has the confidence to be able to compete under democratic conditions. And so they told us, no, Democracy Through Strength is not the title. The title is The Transformations of Modern Asia. I said, the words modern Asia never appear in the book. I don't want people in India or the Philippines or Mongolia to think they're not modern. But no, that's the title. So at least we made it the subtitle. And our backup title for the book, From Development to Democracy, I think actually kind of works because the book is really, it really has as much detail in it about economic development as it does about democratization. But the goal is not to explain economic development, but to talk about how different kinds of economic development in Asia have led to different democratization patterns and outcomes. So that's sort of the broad idea. So the setting for the book is what we call developmental Asia. And this is 12 cases that link Northeast and Southeast Asia. And we divide these 12 cases into 4 distinct clusters. For those of you interested in Asia, I think a lot of what's potentially new here and maybe worth arguing about, but is this effort to kind of rethink Asian space. and get outside the usual Northeast, Southeast Asia dichotomy, and think about these regions as joined together and in a region which was largely shaped originally by the developmental state policies of Japan and its investments in the diffusion across the region. So we'll talk a lot more about what we mean by developmental Asia. The puzzle of the book is this is a region that has obviously experienced a lot of economic development, but much less democratization. For those of you in political science, you'll know that this is sort of the correlation that you can't kill. No matter what you do, how you try to go away the idea that economic development and democratization are highly correlated is really kind of unbreakable correlation. So there is something there, but the question is what? And so we engage with modernization theory. I think we have a different take on modernization theory without entirely rejecting all of its insights. The approach we take in the book is to examine this region, developmental Asia's uneven, and we argue clustered democratization experience from a historical perspective. It's a very historical book. And the argument that we make primarily is that in this region, developmental Asia, the primary mode of democratization has been what we call democracy through strength. Okay. So here I think is sort of a nice way of sort of setting up the puzzle and what the argument is with these two somewhat kind of vivid examples from the late 1980s in Asia. And what we have on the left is the fall of the Marcos regime in the Philippines, and on the right, what we have is the swearing in of a new president, No Tae-woo, in South Korea. And so these are both swearing in. You can see Corazon Aquino is right here taking an oath of office, just like No Tae-woo is. But what we have on the left is what we call democracy through weakness. And I think our theories in political science and in sociology are mostly geared toward explaining how democracy arises through weakness. And because what happened here was, this was sort of the original people power movement, hundreds of thousands of people in the street. Marcos flees, he goes into exile, and you have this toppling of the regime. The authoritarian regime has collapsed, and that's how you get democracy in the Philippines. Basically, I think our theories explain these kinds of transitions pretty well. But what they don't explain as well is the kind of democratization we saw in South Korea, where what you have here is, not very long before this photo, he would have been wearing a military uniform rather than a suit. And what happens in South Korea is the ruling party agrees to undertake democratic concessions. They then compete in elections, and the old authoritarian ruling party manages to win democratic elections. And so I think as a matter of temperament, for those of us of a progressive bent, we think, well, this is democratization. That's just, a wolf putting on sheep's clothing, or that's not real democracy. Real democratization requires you topple these people, you get rid of them, you overthrow the old regime, right? But I don't think anybody would look at South Korea and the Philippines today and say, oh, the Philippines is such a more functional, true democracy, whereas South Korea is not. That even through this sort of democracy through strength scenario, you can get very real, very substantive, not partial. I mean, every democracy is partial, of course, but you get a very robust democracy in South Korea, even though it doesn't come about through the toppling and the removal of the old authoritarian ruling guard. So this is not to argue that this should not happen or that democracy through weakness always leads to instability. That's by no means our argument, but we are just arguing there is another way. And it is not only through authoritarian collapse that democracy arises. Okay, so that's kind of just a basic sort of vignette to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. And so authoritarianism can end without necessarily the old regime all leaving power being toppled. Okay, so just give you a sense of what the book covers. We start with a theory chapter. So that was our clever move. We can't call the book Democracy Through Strength, so we'll call our theory chapter Democracy Through Strength. So I'll be talking a lot about what we mean more specifically by the theory. Chapter 2, for the Asianists in the room, sort of tries to give a sense of how historically this region we call developmental Asia came to be. So we both argue, on the one hand, this is a true world region of 12 cases, but by the same token, it has to be thought of in terms of distinct clusters. So 4 clusters within one world region. So the shaping developmental Asia really tries to give a sense of how kind of the collision of British colonialism, American influence, and the Japanese rise in the region gives rise to this very distinctive region. And then we go through the cases. And so what we do first, primarily Joe, talks through first of all, Japan, as an example of, I think Japan is probably the world's largest and most significant democracy that almost no one ever seems to want to theorize. Generally, the notion is Japan, Japan is a democracy because America put democracy there. which, if you know anything about America's track record of democracy promotion in other parts of Asia, is just not a very satisfactory explanation. So we start off by explaining how the consolidation of democracy in Japan was very much about the LDP's sense of what we call victory confidence and stability confidence. So we go on from there to talk about Taiwan, which is in some ways kind of the exemplar of what democracy through strength looks like, where the KMT was definitely a position where it had a lot of confidence that it could win democratic elections when it conceded a level playing field with the opposition. And indeed, their confidence was proven to be justified. South Korea, slightly weaker case. So there's a real spectrum of authoritarian strengths that these cases will have. South Korea is sort of a notch below Taiwan, but still a regime that conceded democracy with a fair amount of confidence that it would minimally survive and even thrive under democratic conditions. And so then what we do, we split China into two chapters, okay? And so what we do, first of all, is take a chapter in which we talk about China up until 1989 and up until the Tiananmen Square crackdown. And so what we want to do in that chapter is to kind of rethink why China does not democratize in 1989. And the usual interpretation, it's not a wrong interpretation, but is to juxtapose China with other communist cases and to locate sources of regime strength in China that were lacking in Eastern Europe, especially. Right? So the regime was too strong to collapse. This is the usual interpretation of 1989. But when you juxtapose China not as an exceptionally strong communist case, but as a relatively weak developmental case, this is still very, very early in China's economic reforms. The regime does not yet have a really strong track record of producing economic development, a la these other regimes in developmental Asia. So you could also think of China in 1989 as too weak to concede, that the CCP did not have the kind of confidence that regimes in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea did when they implemented democratic reforms that the incumbent, more conservative forces would be able to keep winning elections. So it's a kind of a reinterpretation of China in 1989. So we then move on to then the sort of three of the four clusters in the book. So developmental militarism. So here we're talking about Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar. Developmental Britannia, where we're talking about Malaysia primarily, but also Singapore and Hong Kong. The developmental socialist cluster, where we return to China post-1989 and argue that China has been building up substantial regime strengths, very much like its predecessors in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, which at least makes China a candidate, we argue, for democracy through strength. Doesn't mean it's going to happen for reasons I'll try to illuminate, but we would argue that if the CCP were to pursue the kind of democratic reforms that its predecessors in Asia have, that they would have every reason to believe they could do quite well in elections for quite some time. But then we juxtapose China with Vietnam and Cambodia. And then in our concluding chapter, we ruminate a bit about what this all means about democracy as an Eastern phenomenon, a Western phenomenon. How does bringing Asian democracy into our theories of democratization hopefully enhance our understanding of the phenomenon? Okay, so this is a sense of the book. This is why you should buy it, or at least get it out from the library, or at least cite it. Any of these things are all fine. So let me start by talking through the region before I get into the theory. Okay, so developmental Asia is a historical setting. So what we mean by developmental Asia is that these are Northeast Asia and Southeast Asian polities that have followed a state-sponsored, export-led strategy of rapid economic growth and catch-up, right, with widely varying degrees of commitment and success. Okay, so there's sort of a developmental ethos, an ethos of catch-up in the region that we think helps define it. And so critically, the region as we define it is determined politically and economically, not just geographically. So there are many cases that are geographically within Northeast or Southeast Asia, but are not part of developmental Asia because, as we put it, they never joined developmental Asia. You have to actually join the region with particular developmental policies and a particular approach and orientation toward economic development. So the Philippines, as we started with, again, classic democracy through weakness, right? North Korea, Laos, Brunei, Mongolia, these are cases, these are not included. I will also mention India, because people like to ask about India. You can kind of understand why India is not in the book from the title of the book. So the idea is all of these cases pursued economic development before sort of considering whether to democratize. India is clearly an example that from independence was a democracy from the get-go and tried to go from democracy to development, not from development to democracy. So that's one reason why India is quite different, okay? So this region is a zone of shifting and overlapping American influence, British influence, Japanese influence, and Chinese influence. And so I think a really critical corrective we try to offer here is that this is not a Sino-centric region. Okay? And I think that when people look at Asia now, the inclinations think of, well, Asia means authoritarianism, it means China and regimes under Chinese influence. And in fact, China is not a leader of developmental Asia. China is a latecomer to developmental Asia. And I think that should make us think differently about how we approach questions of democracy and autocracy in Asia. And so, as I've said, this is a region with 4 identifiable clusters, which have had distinctive types of developmentalism. And these different types of economic development have profoundly shaped variation in democratic and authoritarian regimes. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what are the 4 clusters. So first and foremost, we have what we call the developmental status cluster, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Then the developmental socialist cluster, of China, Vietnam, Cambodia. Developmental Britannia, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and developmental militarism, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar, all nicely color-coded for your visual enjoyment. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the region. We can talk a lot more about the particular cases, why we situate them the way we do. But let me sort of talk through the theory, right? So those of you thinking about comprehensive exams or thinking about a lit review, like, okay, so where does this fit? I think I might have read this before. If I read this before, is this new? What's new? What's different here, right? So let me talk through the differences in a much more specific way of how democracy through weakness differs from democracy through strength, and talk a bit about, give you a sense of how some of these other works that we think get you somewhat close to our argument, but don't go quite as far as we do in making the claims that we do. Okay, and again, to reiterate, the theories we have mostly try to understand democracy through this kind of trajectory, a democracy through weakness kind of trajectory. Okay, so what do we mean? So first of all, democracy through weakness means institutional weakness. Okay, the ruling party, the authoritarian state, the military, these kinds of political organizations are relatively weak. They're fragmented. They're not very coherent. They lack infrastructural capacity. Okay, so institutional weakness. In the weakness scenario, rulers are seen as deeply divided. Okay? So O'Donnell and Schmitter once famously argued that there's no democratic transition that doesn't begin with a split within the ruling elite. Okay? We're arguing that is not true. That in fact, we can see these democratic transitions when elites are actually quite unified. It's not because they're divided that democratization begins. In the weakness scenario, democracy is the last resort. The authoritarian regime has tried everything at its disposal, but it simply can't stop the protest. It can't stop the economy from collapsing. It can't stop outside forces from withdrawing aid, et cetera. And the regime sort of, it's the last thing you do is democratize. Okay? It is usually portrayed as a negotiated exit if it's not a pure collapse. So the idea is that you sit down around a round table and there's some kind of agreement made between regime softliners and the moderate opposition, and they come to some kind of pact or some kind of agreement on what terms the regime will actually, these leaders will exit power, so they can do so peacefully. The idea is that what they concede is defeat, right? So that there's an utter defeat of the regime. If you've read Daniel Treisman's really excellent work on this topic, he argues and sort of finds with some really great global quantitative data that in most cases, democracy arises through some kind of miscalculation by authoritarian leaders. So the idea is there's a kind of authoritarian bungling that's going on that leads to democratization. Again, it's the standard scenario. Probably most important to us in terms of a theoretical corrective comes from Osamoligbo and Robinson, who argue really the only reason a dictator would accept democracy is because of the threat of revolution. The only reason you would accept democracy is because you fear that you will go down violently if you don't go down peacefully. And here I think is where our biggest corrective is, as I'll try to explain. The legitimacy of the regime gets relinquished. You're discredited, you're disgraced, you go into exile, etc. The regime happens, the collapse happened quite suddenly. This is something where you turn on CNN and say, wait a minute, there's suddenly hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Where did this come from? And so these things can happen quite quickly. And then there's a lot of elite upheaval. So the idea here is that the old regime elites are kicked out and the old opposition becomes the new regime. So this is, I think, our standard account of how democratization occurs, and it's basically democracy through weakness. Okay? Democracy through strength differs in every of these dimensions. Okay, and to be clear, these are ideal types. Anytime, any real world example of democratization, there will be elements of strength, elements of weakness within the regime. But again, I don't think we've even theorized very well how it could happen through strength. So highlighting the strength aspect of real world cases of democratization, I think is an important corrective. So here, institutions are not weak; they're strong. Okay, this is the strength that makes democracy through strength possible, right? A strong ruling party, okay, a cohesive military that supports the civilian leadership, a strong infrastructural state that can collect taxes, that can actually govern territory, right? So institutional strength. Here again, rulers don't have to be deeply divided, they can be relatively united. And it's because they're united that they realize that we can hold together during a transition phenomenon. And in fact, just a little bit of a sidebar, I think part of the what's mistaken in this literature that sees these divisions, what we found, especially in the military cases we look at, is so there are regime divisions that occur, okay? But what happens is not that when the regime is divided that the regime democratizes, which is what the literature suggests. What we find is when the regime is divided, particularly a military regime, what they do is they purge. You purge your rivals. Only once the military has become reunified do you then consider going through this kind of democratization scenario, once you have reunified the military. So I think it's a kind of missing step in a lot of these. So the stress is on the division, but in fact, again, if you're divided, your first instinct is not to be, oh, we really should democratize because we're so divided, right? Your first instinct, if you're a military commander, is, I'm going to take you out, right? And then you think about what comes next, right? This need not be a last resort. This be a proactive strategy. Again, this is not something that these regimes are forced to do. And that's one reason why, as I'll explain, agency plays a very big role here. Contingency plays a big role, and maybe a role that's larger than we might prefer as theorists of social science who would like to be able to explain through structural, measurable phenomenon why things happen. But there is a lot of agency and contingency because these are regimes with the strength to stay in power, whether they strategize to do so or not. And these don't look like negotiated exits. This is a unilateral leveling of the playing field. So again, a regime that's in a strong position says, we're going to reshape the playing field, we're going to change the rules, we're going to change the laws, we're going to change how elections happen, we're going to open up the process that opposition has more room to maneuver, and then we're going to keep beating you, okay? And we'll keep beating you in elections. But the idea, as Levitsky and Way argue, is that democracy requires a level playing field between government and opposition. So it's very much about ways in which the regime levels the playing field between itself and opposition, okay? They don't concede defeat, they concede democracy, okay? This is, I think, in ways a really, really key point here, right? So again, in this, it's over and over and over again, to my endless frustration, when people talk about China, will the CCP, will China ever democratize? No, the CCP will never give up power. The CCP will never collapse, okay? The whole point here is it doesn't have to collapse for China to democratize. The CCP does not have to give up power for China to democratize. This is so again, I think the most kind of, if you leave this room with only one thing that you remember, just please remember that, right? Democracy does not have to happen in these ways, okay? So you can concede democracy without conceding defeat. That's what happened in Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, for at least for some period of time. But these reforms can be reversed, okay? So rather than thinking of this as dictators bungling, it's more about experimenting. And these are reversible experiments. So the idea is when a regime starts reforming, it can always pull the plug if it feels like it's not going as smoothly or as successfully as they would like, okay? And as a cognitive matter, it's in some ways it's the opposite of a threat of revolution that sparks this. It's expectations of stability. Again, if you feel like you're facing down the threat of a violent revolution, in most cases, an authoritarian regime is not going to think, wow, this would be a great time to reform, okay? Usually what they're going to do is they're going to crack down. Think about places like Syria, right? You can't get more threat of revolution, right? But a threat of, think about what Myanmar has looked like over the past 40 years. Every time there's a major threat of revolution, what do? They crack down, okay? So what makes at least democracy through strength possible is not this imminent fear of a violent demise, but quite the opposite, that you have some expectation, some confidence that if we do liberalize the system, it's not going to lead to our violent demise. So reorient our thinking toward expectations of stability rather than threat of revolution. And if you know my first book, Ordering Power, in a sense, the whole idea behind ordering power is that idea, right? And the ways in which histories of conflict, histories of instability or stability under democratic and authoritarian conditions shapes the calculations of elites about what would democracy look like. Would it lead to more instability? Would it lead to outcomes that we can live with, okay? In this scenario, your legitimacy isn't relinquished as a regime, it gets redefined. So the standard, kind of narrative is, well, we've brought development to the country and now we've brought democracy. And so the idea is, again, you rejuvenate your legitimacy formula. The old authoritarian elites do not lose their legitimacy in this strength scenario. Rather than it being a sudden collapse, this can take the form of sequential concessions. Again, so think of this as a gradual unfolding experiment, which you can do different reforms, one at a time, kind of again, not losing control of the process. And again, one reason why we think it's often strategic for strong regimes to actually preemptively democratize is because if they do it on their own terms, they can do it in their own way. Okay, you're not like under pressure, under duress from opponents to write electoral rules that will disfavor you, right? You can actually do so in your own way, in such a way that will be more favorable to the democratizing elites. Okay, and rather than elite upheaval, you get a lot of elite continuity. Okay, so many people who were in the old regime become major leaders in the new regime. Many people who are opposition under authoritarianism remain opposition under democracy. So there's not this churn and overturning of opponents become regime becomes opponents. Okay, and so in fact, in one reason, again, a very strategic reason why these reforms can actually help the old regime is because if you, again, democratize from a position of strength, it will often have the effect of dividing your opponents, okay? So oftentimes, a democratic opposition arises to oppose an authoritarian regime, and basically the only thing they agree upon is that they don't like the dictatorship, okay? But if the regime takes the authoritarianism off the table, then those opponents are going to tend to disagree about things like economic policy, or they'll be from different regions of the country, as in South Korea. A place like Indonesia, you had an incredibly eclectic opposition movement against Suharto. Once you democratize, they then splinter into all these different parties, which then makes it much easier for the old ruling party to continue to fare well in elections, join governments, and not be ushered out of government. Okay, so again, a main reaction people had to this argument is, well, if you're a strong authoritarian regime, why would you ever democratize? Like, why would you take the risk? Well, there are strategic advantages that you can gain, and it's not the case that there are no risks to simply staying in power and not reforming, as we'll get to. And I think one benefit of the fact that we took so long to write this book, although the press wasn't happy about it, was that it actually gave us a chance to see more examples of how regimes that failed to reform, like in Malaysia, like in Hong Kong, like in Cambodia, that were once in a strong enough position to concede democracy without conceding defeat, were no longer in that strong position. So you can lose this strength over time. So it makes sense to consider democratic reforms when you're still in a strong position rather than a weakened position. Okay? And just to give, again, for those of you doing comprehensive exams, here are some works over here on the right that I think can give you a sense of a lot of the dynamics we're talking about. But ultimately where the literature gets us is that the literature is not too surprised by preemptive liberalization, but they don't think it goes all the way to democratization. And again, as the Korea example, I think shows it can go all the way to democratization. Or what they're looking at is a preemptive, like a true exit from power. And again, we are not talking about exits from power, and we're not talking about just liberalization. This is full-on democratization, but does not necessarily lead to an exit from power. So that's the kind of big theoretical picture and how we're trying to kind of bring a different scenario to bear and how we understand democratization. Okay, so why would this happen? And why would development lead to these kinds of reforms? So in its most bare bones form, the simplest way to think about the intuitions here, right, is that if you're an authoritarian regime that presides over economic development, right, it gives you a couple of things. One thing it gives you is a track record, okay? People, voters, citizens will see this regime has delivered the following, economic development, economic performance. And what that should give the regime is what we call victory confidence, which hopefully is a very intuitive concept to understand. Victory confidence is just your confidence that you can continue to prevail in democratic elections. So if you level the playing field, release political prisoners, allow opposition parties and newspapers to form, right, that you can still win. So victory confidence is about winning, continuing to win elections, using your track record to do so, okay? And I think it's really quite vital if you think about a place like Singapore, or like Japan, or even like Indonesia, that when you've been under an authoritarian regime for decades, which kind of reduces all of politics to economic development, that it really shapes society and it shapes people's expectations of what government provides. So developmental states create developmental voters, right? And so in a lot of ways, the reason these regimes can have confidence is because they have made politics what they want politics to be about for decades, right? And so it's just not the case that when you democratize, people will no longer think that politics is about, well, who's going to produce more public goods, who's going to produce more economic growth, who's going to basically be the more successful economic performer. Right? So neoliberalism, technocracy, these are very, very powerful forces in the world, right? And these regimes deploy them to great effect. Okay. So in addition to the track record that gives you victory confidence, economic development, at least as it's happened in most of developmental Asia to varying degrees, but if it gives you poverty reduction, growth in the middle class, this should give you more stability confidence, okay? And so stability confidence is just your confidence that opening up to democracy is not going to lead to a collapse of law and order or a collapse of the economic development model, okay? So here, this kind of depends on insights from the literature about how, I'm going back to Aristotle, about how one reason that elites resist democratization is their fears of its redistributive pressures, right? That what democracy will do is basically give the many the ability to expropriate the few. Okay? So this gets alleviated at least somewhat. I don't think that's actually what happens in a democracy, but people still think that it does. Okay? They still fear that it does. And so to the extent you've had poverty reduction, you should have more stability confidence. You should be less worried that what democratic elections will lead to is some kind of wholesale, massive redistribution from the wealthy to the poor, okay? So victory confidence and stability confidence, and these are kind of the essence of the matter, right? Regimes with victory and stability confidence are in a position to democratize through strength, okay? So, but why would they do so? Okay, and why does it happen sometimes but not others? And so some of you might be familiar with the article that Joe and I wrote back in 2013, which kind of introduces the theory and which is very much, it was really not much altered in the book. So the argument we make there is that the path to democracy through strength it starts with strength. You have to have strength to democratize through strength, but then it's really these differences in signals and strategies that lead to different outcomes. So vitally, critically, strength itself does not explain democracy through strength. Okay, because we have strong regimes that democratize through strength, and we have strong regimes that resist democratic reforms. So it's these other things that happen which lead down a trail toward the democratic reform. Okay, and I can talk more about each of those in turn, but it's in the article. So there's a spectrum of variation here, right? And I want to emphasize that point, that these are not similarly strong cases, but I do think that they're all above a certain bar, they're stronger than your average authoritarian regime if you look across the entire post-colonial world. So what we wind up is with 6 democratic cases or concession cases, 6 cases that did at one time or another concede democratic reforms. So we have Japan back in the 50s, Taiwan in the 80s and 90s, South Korea in the 80s, Indonesia in the late 90s, Thailand over the course of the 1980s, and Myanmar in the 2010s, about the decade or so between the opening up of the process and the coup in 2021. So Thailand and Myanmar are the 2 clearest examples of reversal, where democracy was undertaken at a time of relative confidence, but for reasons we can get into, was ultimately reversed. And then you have these 6 cases, which are these authoritarian or avoidance cases. These are all cases which, despite their strength, resisted these kind of preemptive democratic reforms. So it's Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And if you're keeping score at home and you're attending this, you should recognize, and this is basically how the idea of clusters came about, that you can just basically say, wait a minute, these cases are kind of similar, and wait a minute, these cases are kind of similar, and wait a minute, these 3 and these 3. And so we sort of recognize just through, basically in a very inductive way, that there were particular clusters of cases that did brave these kind of democratic reforms from positions of strength, and there were clusters of cases that did not. And so something about that clustering seems to matter, okay? So take a step back, think about modernization theory. Modernization theory says, as you get richer, as countries become wealthier, they become more likely to democratize. And if you're a rich democracy, you're less likely to collapse. Okay? So we have these strong, reasons to believe, okay, wealthier countries more likely to be democracies. Okay? So if modernization theory were just right, then what we would see here is the cases of high strength. This includes sort of high economic performance, high wealth, right? That we should see the democratization going horizontally across the top. Okay? We should see Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong. And so it's half right. Okay? So Japan, Taiwan, South Korea make modernization theory look pretty good. But Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong do not. Okay? These are cases that have experienced very substantial economic development, but at no time did their ruling elite say, let's actually attempt this kind of preemptive democratization. Instead, the countries that have attempted it go vertically on the left. So we have one cluster of high strength and one cluster of more intermediate strength. So on any of those dimensions I was talking about regime strength, Indonesia, Thailand, and Myanmar are weaker than Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Okay? And there's a real cluster here too. Indonesia definitely had a stronger developmental track record, stronger political institutions than certainly Myanmar. Much stronger ruling party in Indonesia than, say, Thailand. Okay. So again, there's this real spectrum here. Okay. And if you know anything about these cases, you should not think of this as, you should be seeing the variation within the clusters as well as across them. Right. So in a sense, like there's 4 types here, and there's variation in degree within the clusters. Okay. But the fact that that the variation goes vertically, that democracy avoidance happens in one high strength cluster and one intermediate strength cluster, and the democratic experiments were attempted in one high and one intermediate cluster, suggests that, so these are all above a threshold. They're above a threshold at which democracy through strength was possible, but it's not strength, it's not economic development that explains this variation. Okay. And I think what this clustered approach gives us at least a sense of is it's something about the clusters. Okay. The fact that these clusters correlate so perfectly with whether or not these countries attempt democratic reforms, I think is certainly, suggestive that there's something about these different forms of economic development that matters. And in a sense, it's intuitive because modernization theory says levels of development gives you variation in regime type. And what we're saying is, well, no, actually types of development give you variation in regime type, which seems more intuitive, right? But the hard part is theorizing what exactly that means. What is it about types of development that give you that variation? And here is, I think, where the book to a large extent moves from kind of, political science to political history. There is no kind of very, neat, tidy theory of why it is that a cluster would lead cases to be more prone to democratic reform than other ones. There are a variety of ways that clusters matter that we talk about in the historical sections of the book. We spent a lot of time talking through how economic development gave rise to certain kinds of political organizations, certain levels of confidence in some areas rather than others, elections or not elections. So a lot of this variation, which you really kind of, I think, have to sort of read the book to appreciate the kind of all the heterogeneity within the cases. But the pattern, I think, is quite striking. And I think, hopefully, not only constant, but others will keep looking at these issues and thinking about, well, why would this be? One thing that looms very large, might be on your mind, is just the geopolitics. So you can clearly look at this cluster and say, well, tight security ties to the United States. That seems like part of the story, but I don't think it's the entire story. I don't think there's any single factor within these clusters that that explains the variation. But more than happy to talk about any of these cases during Q&A. Again, the cases that, if you're interested, for purposes of the book, the 6 cases that get most of our attention are these 3, because in a way they kind of set up the kind of clearest examples and historical narratives of how democracy through strength comes about. So it's really these 3. China, again, we talk about in 2 chapters, and then Indonesia and Malaysia get the lion's share of the attention when we talk about the militarist cluster and the developmental Britannia cluster. And so there's the most to read about those, but very happy to talk about any of them if you'd like to talk about particular cases. So a few conclusions for takeaway. So developmental Asia, according to our argument, is not uniquely ill-suited for democratization. And if you listen to these sort of culturalist accounts of Asian politics, or focus on Asian values and democracy is a Western construct, what have you, you might think, okay, well, Asia is going to be really, this is kind of not particularly fertile soil for democracy. We argue that by contrast, this region is distinctly well suited for democracy through strength. So if you focus not on these ostensible cultural differences, but focus instead on these very clear institutional differences in organizational capacity, organizational strength, that you can see why this region is actually extremely well suited for democratic reforms that lead toward these relatively stable outcomes, as we've seen in a good bit of the region. Okay. Another thing to note here is that this modal democratization pathway in Asia, democracy through strength, is actually more comparable to older European cases than it is to a lot of similarly young democracies. We have an article with Rachel Riedel and Daniel Ziblatt, which explores kind of the parallels. And if you know Ziblatt's book on conservative parties and European democratization, there's very clear parallels in our logics. Again, the idea that democracy in Europe came about and was relatively stable, not when conservatives in the old regime were weak, but when they were strong. And so they actually could accept democratization rather than spoiling it. As we all know from all kinds of examples, Brazil, United States, when conservatives are not confident, they don't tend to behave very, very nicely under democracy. So that's, I think we tend to think that regions should be comparable to those that are democratizing in a similar time period. But in this, I think this defies that kind of common sense. Another conclusion I'd like you to take away from this is that when you look at authoritarian regimes, you look at their institutions, you look at their policies, you look at their developmental track records, it's shaping a lot of different things. I mean, one thing it's shaping is just the fate of people who live under these regimes. We should care about them because it's different to live in Singapore or in Myanmar, right? So these differences matter, but it also matters because it shapes the long-term potential for a more stabilizing or destabilizing concession process. Okay, so we get really, really hung up on this kind of collapsism when we think about authoritarian regimes. Everything happens in an authoritarian regime matters because, well, does this make collapse more likely or less likely? And I think that's an incredibly, pinched and not capacious enough way of thinking about why we should study authoritarian regimes and the policies that they pursue, the institutions they build, the developmental track records they develop. Because the kind of strengths we're talking about here, they build up over a long period of time. They don't emerge suddenly. Okay, so you need to take a historical approach to these regimes to understand what kind of strengths they either do or don't enjoy. The kind of pressures that can push, those kind of signals I talked about, those can emerge very suddenly, but those don't make a regime weak or strong. Whether a regime is weak or strong is a function of decades, a function of a very long period of time. Okay, so history matters. Another conclusion I think that is important here is that to the extent that we're in a period of democratic recession or democratic erosion or democratic backsliding, pick your synonym, a lot of it hinges on a lack of confidence that democracy and stability can go together. So to the extent that we can find scenarios and find ways in which democracy does not lead to instability, I think it gives you better prospects for democracy for experiments to unfold and for democracy to take root. And then as a final point, very much related to that, so we argue in this book, and we're kind of very inspired here by our shared mentor, Edward Friedman, who is both of our advisors at the University of Wisconsin, and we dedicate the book to him. I think one of the things we learned from him is, democracy is a universal value. Okay, it's not Western, it's not Eastern, it's a universal value, but it is not the ultimate ends of politics. Okay? So the most important thing at the end of the day, people is not whether or not to live in a democracy. They care about things like prosperity. They care about things like peace. Things like, if you live in a condition of civil war, is your ethnic group going to be treated like a second-class citizen? These kinds of things tend to weigh much more heavily than just what your regime type is. And this is why, ultimately, it's not about East versus West. That democracy is eternally in danger and is always everywhere in danger if it doesn't fulfill these deeper needs for peace, prosperity, etc. And basically, we should kind of cast aside this idea that there's anything naturally or prone toward democracy or authoritarianism in East versus West. I mean, hopefully, the last decade, if nothing else, has given us a little bit, less hubris about the idea that democracy is somehow just naturally suited to the West. But I think we also need to think about the ways in which, there's a lot of very robust democracy in the quote unquote East. And we should be learning from those lessons and not sort of dismissing them as the result of, some kind of American imperial, projection and imposition or something like that. So that hopefully gives you kind of the broad brushstrokes of the book. There's a lot of detail in there that we can talk about, but hopefully we can leave it there and open it up to Q&A and we can keep talking.
Thank you, Dan, for putting a lot on the table. Great ideas, great questions, and it's going to lead to massive discussion.
Massive discussion.
We'll start with constant. And I'll add a few words for Northeast Asia, but constant will focus a lot on South Asia.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. Quite impressive to summarize such a book in that first slide. And I feel like it really captured the core idea of your book in what is the slide. I had one point which I'm not sure, well, 1 point and then 3 smaller ones, which I'm not sure it's within the scope of your arguments. But the question arises, democracy through strength, but what if the former authoritarian people, elites, or whatever we may call it, what if they keep being too strong to then prevent the opposition under a democratic regime, right? Won't they have an incentive to just gradually capture power more and more and to prevent more and more opposition to potentially win elections? So yeah, what if basically the old regime is like too strong. That's a question that like through the book and the paper you published before was always at the back of my mind. Then I have like two smaller points. Like in this picture, like victory confidence depending on track record and track record depending on economic development. But where does the picture of like human rights violation, where does that fit into the picture? And directly, you might say, like, I really like the sentence you say developmental states create developmental voters, but how do the regime then knows that the voter are going to vote because they have a good development economic record and not because they have a bad human rights record somehow? That's another question. And more broadly, still on victory confidence and stability confidence, how concretely can we assess it somehow? Like maybe in some countries, like in Indonesia, for example, it's not clear that it's a victory confidence somehow, because the institutions are extremely complicated. And it's really hard to say that Golkar won the election. They for sure did not lose it. They did not lose it as dramatically as in Myanmar. But was it a victory for them, or what is like, okay, better than the worst they could have imagined somehow? And then the final, maybe technical point. When you developed the argument, Myanmar back then, I assume, was still experiencing democracy. How did you include Myanmar in that? Like, did Myanmar just fit into the case finally, like in February 2021, where I assume most of the framework was in place? Did it come like kind of like a cherry on top of the cake of like, yes, our argument is indeed correct, because sadly, authoritarian reversal in
Before you answer, I'll add a few more. So
Please.
From the Northeast Asia.
Massive. We're not quite massive yet.
So that's the first batch.
The massive point. All right.
Bring a bit of the Northeast Asia response here.
Yeah.
So first, the theoretical question. It's hard to convince fully, but also is inductively the case that any government would launch democracy purely when they're in a strong position. I think the story, I mean, I haven't yet read the details of the book, but I'm sure the story must also take into account, first, a major warning first, second, an understanding that they cannot sustain the authoritarian rule, say, over 10 or 20 years. So that warning, that serious warning and that serious understanding that now they're strong, but the writing is on the wall, has to be there, right? And then when you get to the cases, we know for Korea, the Gwangju massacre was a huge warning, and then followed by massive pressure from the US, beginning with Reagan, and then or even Carter initially, but Reagan, and then you add the Olympics and they decide to join the OECD. They don't have time. They're gonna have to go through democracy. So then they still have strengths and they can engineer it. But the Gwangju warning is immense. For Taiwan, yes, you have a visionary son of Chiang Kai-shek here who is able to think long term, but I think he's deeply aware that the Kuomintang is essentially a foreign party that controls 20% of the population, and that came to power on the back of a massacre, the 228 massacre, and they can't stay very long. Yes, they have massive money, massive power, but any person who understands Xi should know that there's a writing on the wall. And there was lots of contestation rising, right? They had some time. You didn't have to do it now, but the time was not long. So isn't that piece of the story very, very important? When you think theoretically, right? That the credible threat, credible and insight, and then enough strength to do something about it. Second point on theory, you have the second theoretical axis on poverty reduction. And I was going to question whether poverty reduction is the key element or whether land reform is more important, which leads to inequality, right? Equality and inequality, which is a big part of Aristotle, right? A big enough middle class. Because the real lever that you got in Korea and Taiwan is you got a 50% plus middle class, whereas in Thailand you don't, and that's why you have the yellow vest, right? Or China you don't. And clearly in China you would get a coalition in a democracy that would put property taxes on the rich. I mean, there is huge demand for this, but not in Taiwan and Korea.
Right.
And it's because of land reforms.
Yes.
Now, on your side, however, land reforms happen in one more country, which is China.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, there's other things going on there.
Yes.
But for Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, it's also noteworthy that land reform was partly happening because of the Americans. In all cases, the American had a hand in land reforms. The Japanese military government couldn't do it, had a plan for it, but couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And then same with the Korean and the Taiwanese.
Yeah.
And then third, the victory confidence, may want to say something on Chile, even though there's a long time lag. So you can say, yes, it's 30 years later, but that's the other story where there's a great track record and everything and development first. And yes, initially it seems to work. And then now all hell breaks loose for the old party. But yes, there's a 30-year lag. On the empirical side, I really want to hear more on Japan, but I approach it for now with skepticism, right? So that's the case I study the most. Because when we study in depth the negotiation beginning in late 45, once the Americans land, the initial power holders, they fight to death everything. In particular, they fight, and in the end, they do a draft of the Constitution, which is overruled by MacArthur because he hates it. He said those guys will never change. And he writes directly, if, for example, he's the one who writes Article 1 and takes away power from the emperor. They were fighting for the emperor. And the other reason why it could succeed with American presence in Japan and not elsewhere is because of the emperor. Because everything was under the emperor, through the emperor, and the Americans wisely kept the emperor and went through the emperor to impose democracy. So it's a very unusual story. And everything else, so that's phase one. Then phase two, and that's where you had Dowers at MIT coming back saying, actually, there was still a lot of negotiation. So in the details, yes, the LDP, after being beaten up for 2 years, then they get into a negotiation process. And a lot of the following steps will be negotiated. But it's really a hybrid story. Initially, they're really beaten up and it's imposed. On Hong Kong, I really have doubt to put it as an equal case, simply because, in statistics we would throw it out because it's not independent. Under the British really rule it as a short-term colony. They don't have a long-term stake in it, and they decide everything. And then they rule it in all the secret negotiations we know as a tool in their bargaining with China. So it's never a case on its own. And then the Chinese, of course, they are the Chinese. So it's a China case, right? So I really have a hard time seeing Hong Kong as an independent case. And they call it Britannia, because it was always this weird short-term tool, right? That's not independent. But so this is, I guess that's the first batch from South Asia and Northeast Asia.
Working towards massive.
I have massive answers.
But we love the book, right?
I have massive answers. Well, I could definitely do a whole other talk just answering each of these. I do have answers to all these. Let's just go through it. Let me do a little bit of this. Let's start with Japan. So how does Japan kind of fit the argument that we're making here, right? And so again, you think of it as, so one thing you want to distinguish here is a country can be weak, but its conservatives can be strong. Okay. So this is also true like of Indonesia after 1998, right? The country is on its knees. The country's had this massive economic crisis, right? It doesn't mean that the conservatives within the position are in a particularly weak position. So in Japan, so obviously it stretches this notion of signal, right? So defeat in war. Having nuclear bombs dropped on you is a lot more than a signal, right? So I don't want to minimize it by using that term, but so clearly there's both the need for and there's the pressure to pursue a different path, right? But so whereas World War II clearly weakened Japan, it strengthened the position of civilian conservatives. Okay, so in the interwar period, right, you did get, and we try to show, substantial party and bureaucratic development, before World War II. But basically, those conservative elites, civilian elites, were completely overpowered by the military and by the monarchy. And so the reason World War II really mattered was because it completely destroyed the military and substantially weakened the monarchy, such that those civilian conservatives that had been built up over basically through the Meiji Restoration, through the Taisho period, to a position where they actually could win elections, could govern if they had the opportunity to. So America did not democratize Japan, but America did demilitarize Japan. And that's one reason why, which was really, really, really critical. And then again, I think this is something where the gradual, nature of democratization really, really matters. If you think of democratization as something that takes time, as something that happens through gradual concessions, you have to think about the entire occupation period, the LDP development period as part of how democracy is becoming installed in Japan. Okay, so it doesn't happen just in a moment. And to me, the big puzzle here about Japan, and this is here I think India is really quite relevant actually. So why did Japan never become a bureaucratic authoritarian regime during the Cold War period? South Korea did, Taiwan did, all these places strongly tied to the Americans became bureaucratic authoritarian. And I think basically it's because the LDP never lost its victory confidence. It never lost its stability confidence. It knew it could keep winning. It didn't have to have this it didn't need all kinds of authoritarian laws to make sure it could keep winning elections. And I think that's really the kind of the vital point there. And so this, at least, I think, gets us Japan into the theoretical conversation. My real concern is that I would much rather have these debates and discussions than say, well, Japan is just it's just weird or it's just an outlier. I think Japanese democracy is homegrown in many important ways. It's home sustained, and we do it injustice, I think, when we see it only as something that, again, as if the Americans had a Midas touch in Japan, but almost nowhere else, right? The land reform point is really, really vital too. I want to say a little more about that. Let me see if I can find my this isn't slide here, right? Because we really stress this point. So if you've read Barrington Moore, or if you know about Barrington Moore's argument about the most important, and as a matter of social structure and social class, the most, not everywhere, Chile not so much, but generally speaking, large landlords are the biggest obstacle to democratization. And so when you think about land reform, you have to just picture this as, imagine going to the countryside in Japan, in Taiwan, in South Korea, and removing these large landholders and replacing them with what would be these clientelist politicians, people who could deliver pork barrel goodies to their districts and could compete in elections, and there was all this economic growth which they could then kind of distribute and build up these clienteles, right? So from a Barrington Moore perspective, like, land reform is really, really important. And there's a very clear reason to expect why land reform would be so important. So again, so when we talk about poverty reduction, right? So the developmental status cluster is the extreme, right? It's it's very, very clearly the most extreme examples here, right? Okay, so that's a little bit on Japan. On Hong Kong, I guess what I would say, it's clearly not an independent case, but I think it's informative in a variety of ways. So one way that's informative is that I think you can think of the kind of gradual reforms that the British were putting in the 1990s as a product of their victory and stability confidence. I think the Brits legitimately would have liked to have just left a totally democratic system in place when they left, partly because again, after all the economic development, relatively strong popular conservatives, a developmental citizenry, geared toward economic development, that the conservatives were in a pretty strong position. And when I did interviews in Hong Kong with conservative politicians, you got the sense from them that if it were in their hands, they would have actually liked to have opened up the process earlier when they were still in a strong position, when the economy was still booming, when the transfer of power wasn't still totally unpopular. There wasn't a sense that China was going to basically ram a security law down their throats. That they, and people did vote for the conservatives in Hong Kong, right? But they missed the window of opportunity, right? And I think conservatives in Hong Kong see how now they can't win elections, and because they were held back in some ways by Beijing from doing so. So it's, I think Japan and Hong Kong are both cases where, the wrinkles are enormous, right? There are some very, very clear, differences about, in terms of sovereignty and, the agency of these cases to be self-determining. But I think in each case, these factors of victory confidence, stability confidence, are really, really massive variables that help us understand how these things sort of came about. On the question about, so I like the phrase is the writing on the wall. That's kind of a nice way of putting it. So we talk about these, so just to get into this theory of signals, right? So we talk about, how electricals, and you can also think about pressures. These signals, what the signals are really showing usually is some kind of pressure, right? So you can get these electoral signals, so you're not doing as well in elections in a place like Singapore or Malaysia, right? You get these economic signals where you have some big economic downturn. And these contentious signals in Gwangju, these examples of massive protests, these geopolitical signals when your foreign patron is no longer like supporting you. So these are all really, these are really important. Trying to go back to these language here, right? So these warnings, like there are pressures, there are warnings, there's signals. Something something is changing here, right? And so the way we put in the book is to say that, okay, so you have these institutionally strong authoritarian regimes. We don't think they're likely to, even though it might be strategic to, we don't think they're likely to just pursue reforms just out of the absolute clear blue sky when nothing is going on, right? But if either, so stable domination, if stable domination still seems readily attainable under authoritarianism, or if you don't think your authoritarian strengths can translate into democratic prowess, right, then you're really unlikely to pursue these reforms, right? And so what seems to be required are either these ominous, or some mix of these ominous signals, right, that show you kind of past your apex of authoritarian power, right? You're no longer able just to stay on this kind of, smooth kind of cruise control in which your popularity and your strength is remaining constant, right? But you still also have to have these reassuring signals you possess enough strength to thrive under democracy. So the way we put it in our earlier article here is we call this bittersweet spot, when you're most likely to get these kind of reforms. So it's a sweet spot in the sense that it's, if you do it now, you're still strong enough to still, win elections, maintain your economic development model, this kind of thing. But it's bitter because there's usually some bad news. Okay, so these pressures, these warnings, these signals, you're totally right to stress these points, right? But what I would really stress here, and it goes back to that point I was making about taking the long-term perspective. So just because a regime is on hard times or is facing more pressure or these warnings or these signals, it doesn't mean the regime is weak. Okay, so I would really kind of distinguish those two things, right? So think about a bridge, right? So a bridge is either strong or weak. You drive a really big truck across a bridge, right? So if the bridge is strong, it can withhold it, right? But how heavy and how strong, how massive the truck is doesn't tell you how strong the bridge is. Those are different things. So you have to determine the strength of the bridge. What's the strength of the regime is this long-term phenomenon, and then look at the pressures it's under. Okay? Then look at the challenges it's facing. So the CCP is facing all kinds of new challenges, right, over the last couple of years. COVID, and then with the protests, and so that does not make the regime weaker. It means a strong regime is under increasing pressure. Okay? So those things really, really matter, but they're not a case of weakening or of that there's, I don't think that in these cases there was a credible, I wouldn't go as far as you say this credible threat, right? That, no, I mean, they cracked down in 1980, they could have cracked down again, right? Look at Myanmar, look at Thailand, places, the capacity to crack down even when it seems like you don't have the option to crack down. All of these places could have turned in an authoritarian direction. Also with Japan, if Japan had said, we're going to basically call off the election thing, we're going to become another of these bureaucratic authoritarian regimes, you think the Americans would have stopped it? Well, the Americans would have cared much at all, right? It would have been perfectly fine. They were perfectly happy with it happening throughout the region. So, I'm with you to pressure, I'm with you to warnings, I'm with you to signals, not quite with you to writing on the wall, and not quite with you all the way to credible threat. Certainly not a revolutionary threat. Lots more. Maybe we should, I definitely want to talk to Constant more too, but maybe we should open up to make sure we're getting other questions in. That's okay? Should I just field my own? Is that?
Okay, yeah. And then Brent will help with the online one.
Yeah, if I raise my hand,
great.
it's not me asking
Thanks.
a question, it's the Zoom chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
Jordan, you want to?
Great. So just going back to the clusters, you had two categories. You had high strength and intermediate strength. I was just wondering if you could speak for a moment about how you would define strength, and particularly your decision to classify China in the intermediate strength category, as I understand it. And then secondly, just for the graduate students in the room and many online, we have honors students, MAs, PhDs. Just wondering if you could briefly comment on at what point in your academic journey you knew you would study democracy, Asia, and development. If you should just comment on that for us who are in our journeys right now.
Guess which question is harder? No, so basically the most simple way to think about these strengths, right, is institutional strength, organizational strength. So when thinking about what's high, what's intermediate, right, it's most importantly this antecedent state strength, Okay, we have a lot of different benchmarks for measuring state strength, and then the strength of the ruling party. And I could say to you that we have some kind of precise measure that tells you exactly why it's exactly where it is. But one thing I'll say is we've probably given this some version of this talk many dozens of times, and different versions of what we've written have been read by many reviewers, right? No one has ever said to us, you've misranked these. Like, no, this is actually, it's really not that hard to determine the kind of overall institutional strength of these regimes. It's not really that controversial. I think that the thing with China, part of the, in a way, the way to think about that it kind of evolved was, if you start from here, right? You think, well, China, you think China, obviously lots of institutional strengths, right? But at some point, you just sort of realize, like, what should you be comparing China with? Okay, and so you could ask a question like, is China as institutionally strong as Singapore or as Malaysia? And you sort of say, well, I don't know. Like, it's kind of hard to answer because they're just so different, right? But if you put China next to Vietnam and Cambodia, you say, oh, now you can sort of see, you feel like you're comparing like with like, And so, to me, again, in the case of China, so why wouldn't China just be strong? So here you can just look at economic development, right? So if you go to these, this is just basically looking at GDP. And so the socialist cluster is much weaker. China is the richest within the socialist cluster, but I mean, China's not a high, it's nothing close to, it's still low to middle income country, right? And so and I think again that and then you also have, I think it matters that the difference between a ruling party that has thrived under multi-party conditions and has a lot of electoral experience versus one that doesn't. So the fact that the CCP has less of an immediate sense of what would happen in elections with a level playing field as, say, the PAP in Singapore, right? Or then what UMNO and the BN, the ruling in Malaysia, would have every reason to know as of the late 1990s, right? They have a pretty clear sense of what your level of support is. So those are a couple of reasons why I think the socialist cluster we would put in the intermediate category. But certainly, I think you would say that, again, whether you draw a line between the high and the intermediate or not, it's kind of artificial, right? But I do think that there are institutional strengths and matters of economic track record in the upper parts that are certainly lesser in the lower ones. In terms of my own trajectory, so one reason we were okay with this retitling of the book is From Development to Democracy, because one thing it actually captured, we talk about this in the preface, is it kind of captures our own intellectual trajectories. Because both Joe and I kind of really started studying Asia as undergraduates in the 90s, and the reason we were studying Asia was development, right? That was the thing to study. Like, if you were interested in development, you studied Asia. If you studied Asia, you studied development. It was just the thing to study. And it was really only gradually that we became more interested in these questions of democracy. We weren't drawn to Asia because of the question of democracy. But once you go, and once you're there, you realize there's more of it than you're led to believe. And at least for me, it was certainly living in Malaysia in 1998 during the financial crisis and kind of watching the crackdown unfold in Malaysia, while at the same time, so Indonesia has this dramatic democratic breakthrough, Malaysia has this shocking crackdown. And at the beginning of the crisis, you would have thought the opposite. And people definitely thought, well, Malaysia is this kind of soft authoritarian regime, or it's this semi-authoritarian, it's a semi-democracy, or it's all these great hybrid terms, right? But Indonesia was this military dictatorship, and so you would have expected Indonesia would have this big crackdown and Malaysia would actually liberalize. But it was just the opposite. And so to me, I became very motivated by that puzzle and trying to understand that. So I think the main answer to your question is it's just real things in the world, what is it that you study? It should be the questions that rise in your mind. Like, what do you look at the world and you just don't get? And maybe more importantly, what does it bother you that you don't get? Like, what do you feel like you should understand that you don't understand? I think that's a pretty good way of knowing what things you want to spend your time looking at.
Thank you so much.
Does China not have what the others and the reassuring statement? And the fact that it has, when it miss the opportunity, or does that say something about other factors that lead to possible like democratization?
Yeah. So again, if we go back to the basic idea here, right? So you've got to have the strength in the first place. I think China definitely has the strength. Then we can talk about the signals and these questions of strategies, right? At the end of the day, the strategies are largely unpredictable, right? There's not a very, I think, clear way to predict. They can look very different. So you've mentioned the example of Zhang Xingguo in Taiwan. So you use this sort of great leader theory. It's like, well, this person had total control of the KMT, so you can move the party in this decisive direction, and so you need that. But then you look at Indonesia, where a complete historical nobody, B.J. Habibie, it's the weakest president you can imagine. He puts these reforms in, and the whole ruling party goes along, right? And why do they go along? This is back to Constance's question, right? Because a lot of people in Golkar are like, we're finally free of Suharto. We can be an actual party now, rather than just kind of the plaything of the old dictator. And so a lot of these guys are from Eastern Indonesia, and they're from areas where there's not a lot of political pluralism, and they're going to do pretty well. So just as a little bit of a side to go back to Constance's point. But so you have to get to the strategies, and I think here the geopolitics looms very, very large. I think that the fact that U.S.-China rivalry has taken the form that it does means that there's going to be a level of resistance to democratization in China much greater than if that were not the case. I think that it's become almost a matter of identity that the U.S. and China increasingly define themselves vis-a-vis each other. I think I haven't had the chance to sort of sit down, or even maybe the motivation to sit down and think, well, are these signals that China's facing, like, where do they fit within our theory, right? Because I think that the CCP remains very, very confident in its model. And I think that, whether, and we'll see how the next steps go, but the idea that anything has happened that shows that the CCP's development model is kind of outdated or is unable to solve problems, I think it's too early to say that. I think they're sitting on a lot of reserves, and I think they have a lot of things up their sleeve that they can do to try to deal with these problems of of financial imbalance and the like. And so I think that you certainly have some leaders are bigger control freaks than others. I think Xi Jinping is pretty clearly a bigger control freak than his predecessors. Like, I don't think that that's something you can theorize exactly, but I think it certainly seems to make sense of how these things have unfolded. But I do think that when we would give this talk in China, kind of in the early Xi years, and people really felt like there were just a lot of it would generate a lot of discussion about where China was in this kind of arc. What was the regime starting to weaken? Was it seeing signals or not? And you should get a lot of disagreement. And generally, this is why I think the clarity of these signals, the clarity of these pressures is really, really important. Something like Gwangju, something like the Asian financial crisis in Indonesia, like these have a strength and clarity to them that I think is not the case in China today. So I think we could I imagine if we all filled out a questionnaire about what we thought was happening in China right now, we'd have just totally different answers. It'd be all over the map, because it's not that clear. I don't think there are particularly clear, strong, ominous signals for the regime at this point. At least I wouldn't put it in that category yet. I think they have a lot of confidence that they have their ways of solving these problems, or at least making the problems they're facing not rise to the level of of a real, like, a system threatening kind of problem. I don't think the CCP is anywhere near collapse. These people who are talking about, I think that's absolutely, I don't see any signs of that at all. But is this a more interesting and tougher conversation today than 3 years ago? You bet it is. So I do think that these signs of pressure, these warnings, these difficulties the CCP is facing now, hopefully what our book will do is allow you to think about it in multiple ways, right? So I think the only tool we have to think about it beforehand, it's like, well, does this get us closer to collapse or not? Okay. And I think what hopefully this book will help people to think about is like, well, are these the kinds of signals that would make the regime think we both could and maybe should and would actually do pretty well if we pursued a different direction, right, without collapsing? So this is not just a, China is a 10, 0 is collapse, 10 is stability, right? It's now moved from 10 to 9, right? Okay. Well, I think there's a lot more interesting, the content of the crisis, the characteristics of the leadership as they confront these pressures. And again, distinguishing the pressures a regime is under from the strengths a regime possesses, I think is really, really vital. Because I don't think the CCP is confronting these massive challenges as a weak regime. It's confronting them as a very, very strong regime.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I enjoyed listening. Few questions. I think first we are taking democracy as a given desirable. More than 110 countries are perhaps democratic. They claim they are democratic. So the second question is, perhaps we also assume we know what is democracy. We have a settled, agreed template. So I'm not sure if democracy is the most desirable. I'm not sure if we have a cut and dry consensus definition of what the democracy is. Democracy is thrown up for leaders like Trump or Bolsonaro, Erdogan, or can go on naming names. Chinese would say Xi Jinping. So democracy also is seen as perhaps one of the most vulnerable systems, allowing external powers to go and influence internal dynamics of a democratic country. If it was authoritarian like North Korea, no great powers can influence internal dynamics. So the question is, the democracy really, we know what it is the democracy the most desirable? Another element I thought was interesting is the transformative Asia that the book looks at. I have not even read the book. That looks only at the Pacific flank of Asia, not Asia actually, because Asia is somewhere else. And that Asia obviously is either will not deliver a case which fits in your study, or there could be another reason why that part of Asia did not kind of get your attention. Development to democracy, if the title gives me an indication, perhaps also supports the idea that development would perhaps make democracy more desirable. And that again, you yourself said, India became democratic at the very independence. When it was completely deindustrialized. So again, does development have any connection? And do we mean development in terms of growth only, in terms of these tiger economies? So what is development itself? Bhutan is an interesting case of development. Again, an important, powerful authoritarian regime allowing their own people to develop democracy on their own in a peaceful manner. Again, is not some case that attracted your attention. So I understand democracy is a head that fits every head today. So it's a challenging task that you have taken upon yourself to define development democracy and pick up the Pacific flank of Asia and try to build clusters. It's a challenging task. I look forward to it.
Thank you. I don't, I don't think I still don't think there's a single template for democracy. And certainly the vulnerabilities you talked about are very real. And so I think that there's a lot of lack of or threats to confidence in the desirability of democracy that have been arising recently. I guess I'm not sure if the theory we have requires that democracy be seen as a desirable or seen as superior in some ways. I don't think it requires it. I think that there's probably ways in which, so in a place like Indonesia, 1988, 1999, this is a time, this kind of high watermark of democracy in the world, right? So I do think there's probably some undercurrent going on beneath the level of our theory that is saying, okay, so Suharto's got to go. We need to kind of, clean up this mess within the military. What are we going to do? That there's probably a way in which multi-party democracy seemed like a natural solution in a way that it might not quite as naturally today. And so maybe if you had the exact same thing happen in 2022, that maybe the military would have, tried to hold on, and they would have, not opened things up as quickly. So I do think there's something there, but it's sort of another variable. The main point we're making is it's not that democracy is desirable to these. I mean, someone like B.J. Habibi or Jiang Zhengguo, these people are perfectly comfortable running things in an authoritarian way. I mean, no taboo, perfectly comfortable with the Gwangju massacre, right? These people are not. This is not about values. It's not about belief in democracy. It's about this is gonna solve some problems for us, right? And guess what? I have the luxury of being in a position where I can actually do pretty well, with using this, this technology, right? It's essentially, you can think of democracy as sort of a technology for solving governance problems, right? It's one way of trying to settle disputes. It's one way of trying to organize, affairs. Like, let's hold these elections, and then let's put these constraints on, and put these rules on. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and it probably at some baseline makes what we're talking about less likely than it was, say, 20, 25 years ago. But it's not part of the theory, and it's not something that can readily, I would say, just there are times with global democratization waves and reverse waves when these kind of reforms, I think, are more or less likely. And a lot of the cases we're looking at are in a pretty similar time period, either kind of late Cold War or post-Cold War, where there's a pretty good amount of democratic momentum in the world. So I think I think a smart critique of the book and a corrective to the book would say something like, there's a global democratic momentum going on here during this time period, which you can't take for granted, and that's actually doing a lot more of the work than you acknowledge. And these focus on these internal things, they don't really work. You're not going to get to these reforms other than through that kind of underswell that's happening, globally at this period of time, and that. And so when you look at these things in the interwar period, or you look at you're not going to see these same kinds of, it doesn't play out the same way. I think that would be a very interesting extension and critique of and challenge to the way that we've set things up. So I think that's something that's kind of implied by the question, and that these are really, really important questions of like, well, how we define democracy, how we're defining development. Part of the way we approached it was to just up front say, here's what we mean by it. Democracy requires a lot more than this level playing field, but a level playing field does matter. That's what we're focused on. Development requires a lot more than rising GDP, a lot more than these things. But it's the phenomenon we're kind of looking at here that we think is the one that produces these effects. So hopefully we're able to strike this balance where we can talk about democracy and development in a way that's tractable. Like, it should be clear what we mean by it, but hopefully we're not foreclosing people from taking a more rich, substantive definition of these things than the aspects we look at in the book.
Coming back to this comment just now, so in terms of context, if you had the bigger context of like the apogee of democratization at the end of the 80s, you probably have a consideration for cost and benefit in terms of like, should we keep authoritarian regime, like a strong hand, like military going after people, crackdown, etc., or democratization? And it seems like, democratization seems cost benefit wise easier to go as a tool. Would there be some kind of a consideration like that taken at some point in this sort of bargaining?
That, like, when you're not in this sort of apogee of democratization, you mean, like in a different time period, or?
Well, yeah, because maybe that's the context makes democratization sort of a cheaper option to go through your
Yeah, I think so. But but I also, as I'm thinking about these things, I've been doing some as a follow-up project in these very early days, but I'm doing some work on decolonization and sort of looking at these things in earlier time periods. So looking at particularly the British Empire. So as the British Empire, as we're moving toward independence, how did the British look at like opening up the electoral process? Like where did they actually expand the franchise? Where did they not? And this might be one of these cases where you can only see your next project through the lenses of your last project. But when you read what British officials are saying, right, it's very much about who's going to win. Like, is this going to destabilize things or not? It really does seem like it's through a story of confidence. It's through a story of, okay, it's not that we face little choice, although after World War II they faced less choice, but we face little risk. Like it's not too risky to do it now in this way. And then when it goes badly, they pull the plug, right? So I do think there's something more not historically specific about, in a very, very generic way, like when do rulers of whatever sort who have some kind of authoritarian control, when are they willing to democratize the system, And I think basically we have a strong sense of like, well, if they have little choice because there's so much pressure and revolutionary threat and all this stuff. So we know that. And I do think it's kind of more transhistorically, recurrently true that one thing that can do this is these perceptions that there's little risk. And I think that's where our story lies. And that's not a story about, again, these global undercurrents or these apogees or global nadirs of democracy or that kind of thing. But I do think that part of the story holds true. I think it's and if at times when it doesn't, I think it holds true enough that when it doesn't, that would also be interesting. That you could actually think of that as like, the point of a theory is not that it's always right, but that it's right often enough that it makes you say, oh, that's actually a negative case. Like that's an interestingly negative case where the theory is decent enough that I can see when it doesn't work, and that's interesting. You can notice it not working. So hopefully at least kind of rises to that level. So we can see these like, yeah, you're right. Like maybe that wouldn't have happened the same way. And you can see how it's hopefully, when it's wrong, it's informatively wrong.
Alan. It's a really interesting argument. One thing there's sort of two connected thoughts I've been wrestling with. What are your thoughts on? So this question of what is the level of risk that the ruling party faces if democratized, presumably is partly a function of what exactly democracy looks like, right? What the democracy comes in many forms, right? So what constitutional rights are, what kinds of safeguards might be built in that might make it easier for the incumbent party to keep winning. So that's one thought. And the other sort of connected thought is presumably what kinds of institutions you can get to if you're that ruling party are a function of your strength, right? The relative sort of balance of forces. So I'm wondering, this is kind of taking things a little, I think, beyond the scope of what you cover in the book, but is it your sense that we get different kinds of democracies through strength than we get through weakness or collapse?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think it's partly beyond the scope and partly not. We definitely make the argument that if you kind of fix the roof when the sun is shining, right? If you're not under incredibly intense pressure or the regime is not dividing from within and you start pursuing these reforms, you just have a lot more control over the process. And you can put in things like, guaranteed seats for the military in parliament, things like that. You can do things like, if it had a lick of sense, and the military in Burma does not have a lick of sense from anything that I can see, they would have rewritten the electoral rules, in a way to make sure that the NLD wouldn't win absolutely everything. They could have just simply done it through constitutional engineering, and they just didn't do it, right? Partly, again, a regime with a lack of capacity, a lack of strength, and they just don't engineer it as effectively for themselves as it happens in Thailand, or as happens in Indonesia, or certainly in Taiwan, for instance, right? Where again, it's like, okay, we're gonna, first you allow non-party, like we'll allow opponents, but they can't be in a party, right? So again, it's this gradual, we're gonna basically make sure things don't go off the rails doing this, and then, so that is very much the case. And you can it's just really clear. I think it's just really clear from these spectrums, right? You can just see how much control they have over it, kind of from how strong you are. How strong you are largely shapes how much you can define the transition process. And it really shapes very strongly how well you're going to do, after you democratize. It's just not that unpredictable. It's just not, if you're the PAP in Singapore, like it's just not that unpredictable. Like there's no really big surprise if it would not have been a big surprise if Malaysia had, actually, opened things up in 1999. Like it's not that confusing. Like, we know that, wow, we have no idea what would happen. Oh, we know what would have happened. We know perfectly well what would have happened. So I just don't think it's that unpredictable. And then, yeah, I think with again, we're working with a truncated sample in the sense that basically any place that democratized due to weakness that we're just not talking about. So if somebody again, that'd be an interesting extension, is like, okay, well, let's actually look at, like, again, Philippines as opposed to, or let's look at Thailand, like in different times when it democratized under like very serious public pressure, like 1992, versus when it kind of did so on its own terms in the 1980s. Did that give us different institutions, different outcomes? That would be, I think, really interesting. We don't want to, sort of make claims about what democracy through weakness leads to, because it's not what the book is about, and I think that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Clearly, sometimes it leads to like a lot of the democratic dysfunction, but not necessarily. And in fact, in the conclusion, we do talk about, we try to address this whole, you guys might be aware of this, this whole sequencing debate. So there's this whole debate about, well, do you need to build like strong state institutions before you democratize? Okay, like so places that have weak political institutions, should they basically stay authoritarian and try to build these strong institutions and then democratize? Or can you democratize right away and get like good outcomes even if you don't? And so what we argue in the conclusion is that either way can lead to stability, but just through different mechanisms. And that you do get cases, a case like Timor-Leste is a very good example, right? Which is a pretty high functioning democracy despite not very strong institutions. And the reason why, what it takes to make democracy stable is you just need some kind of settlement among groups. Groups just have to agree that they're going to accept electoral results. They're not going to undermine them. They'll continue to compete. They're not going to take up arms. Like, that's what it requires, right? Under authoritarian conditions, right, what it really requires is these strong organizations that can actually dominate, right? And if you don't, then you get, both authoritarianism and a lot of instability. And so if it were the case that, you can only build strong organizations and strong institutions under authoritarianism, that'd be one thing, but that's clearly not the case. And so we are not siding in that sequencing debate in a way that says, you don't do what the Philippines do, do what South Korea did, or good thing China didn't democratize in 1989, but now they should consider it. Like, that's definitely not what we're saying.
So I know we're at the end of our time.
We just got here.
Yeah, we just got here. So we first
I thought it was going to be massive. We're not so massive yet.
We have a lot more to talk.
Good.
For now, let's applaud.
Thank you.